Hello, how are you? Today I'm going to tell you a different story. Sit back, focus on the story, and drift off to sleep peacefully. First, subscribe and please leave a comment. It is deep in the sailing season of a year in the 4th century BC, somewhere in the open water between the islands of the Cyclades, when the merchant ship Halcyon is by a storm that no one aboard her had predicted when they left the harbor of Delos 2 days earlier. A young sailor named Philemon, barely 17 and only in his second full season at sea, clings to a line near the mast as rain drives sideways across the deck, and beside him the ship's helmsman, a weathered man named Nicias, who has spent more than 30 years working these waters, fights the steering oar with the calm, economical movements of someone who has survived worse nights than this one and expects, though he does not say so aloud to the frightened boy beside him, that tonight may test even that experience. The Halcyon is a modest trading vessel, broad-bellied and slow by the standards of the swift naval triremes that patrolled these same waters in wartime, built instead to carry cargo, wine, olive oil, and pottery from island to island across the Aegean, a livelihood that depends entirely on ships like this one reaching their harbors intact season after season. Her captain, a merchant named Stratton, who owns a share in the ship alongside 2 partners back in Athens, has sailed this same island route for 20 years, and it is Stratton's voice Philemon hears now, shouting orders over the wind to reef the sail before the mast itself takes more strain rigging can bear. Philemon has been frightened before on this ship, in smaller storms, in rough crossings that seemed dangerous enough at the time, but nothing in his short experience has prepared him for the particular violence of tonight. Waves rising higher than the ship's low rail, lightning splitting the sky in jagged white cracks that leave spots swimming in his vision each time it flashes. It is Nicias who first notices it, in a lull between 2 especially violent gusts, and his sharp intake of breath is enough to make Philemon turn from his own work to follow the pale blue-white light has begun to glow, faint at first, and then steadier, clinging to the wood and the taut ropes around it like a flame that gives off no smoke and consumes nothing, flickering and dancing along the rigging with a strange, cold brightness, unlike any fire either of them has ever tended in a ship's hearth or torch. Philemon feels his whole body go still with a fear more complete than anything the storm itself has managed to produce in him, because he has heard sailors' stories his whole life about lights appearing on masts in the worst of storms, and he understands in the same instant that Nicias' face shifts from alarm into something closer to a fierce, unexpected relief. Exactly what kind of story he may be about to find himself inside. Nicias grips Philemon's shoulder hard enough to hurt and shouts over the wind that the boy should look carefully, because what is burning at the top of their mast tonight is not an ordinary fire and poses no danger to the ship at all, but is instead the sign sailors across the whole of the Greek world have prayed for in storms like this one, since long before either of their grandfathers were born. The appearance of the Dioskuroi, the twin brothers, Castor and Polydeuces, sons of Zeus and protectors of every ship, and sailor who calls upon them in danger at sea. Philemon has grown up hearing the hymns sung to these twin gods in the harbor towns of his childhood, has seen their images painted on the walls of small shrines near the docks where sailors leave offerings before departing on dangerous crossings, but he has never, until this exact moment, stood beneath the actual, undeniable evidence of their presence, glowing cold and pale and unmistakable against the violence of the storm raging all around the small, struggling ship. But Nicias's relief, Philemon notices, even through his own astonishment, has not yet settled into full confidence, and the older sailor's eyes remain fixed upward with an intensity that suggests something more is still being decided. Philemon does not yet know, though he learns it in the next few shouted words from Nicias, that sailors across the Greek world have long held a specific and closely watched distinction regarding this exact phenomenon, passed down through generations of men who have watched storms from open decks, with nothing but old sailors' wisdom to guide their reading of the sky, that a single light appearing alone at the masthead is no cause for celebration at all, but is instead associated with Helen, the twins' own sister, whose presence alone at sea is remembered in old stories as an omen of continued danger and worse weather still to come, while two lights appearing together, the brothers Castor and Polydeuces, both present rather than their sister alone, mark instead a sign of imminent safety, the storm's violence already beginning to break, even if the ship's crew cannot yet feel that shift in the wind and water around them. For several long, agonizing minutes, only the single light burns at the masthead, flickering steadily in the wind, but showing no sign of dividing or multiplying, and Philemon watches Nicias's jaw tighten with each passing moment that the second light fails to appear, the older sailors earlier. Relief curdling slowly back into something closer to the same fear gripping the rest of the crew. Captain Straighton, working the deck below with the rest of the crew to secure loose cargo before a wave can wash it overboard, glances upward himself now and then between tasks, and Philemon sees the same calculation playing out on his captain's weathered face that he can read in Nicias's. A ship's fate, in this moment, seems to hang not only on the strength of her timbers and the skill of her crew, but on whether a second point of pale fire chooses to join the first atop a swaying, storm-battered mast. It is a fresh and violent gust, strong enough to heel the whole ship hard to one side and send everyone not out already gripping a line stumbling across the slick deck, that finally seems to answer the question for them. As the ship rights herself, groaning through every timber, a second light kindles at the masthead beside the first, fainter at first, and then strengthening until it burns as steadily as its twin, the two pale flames now dancing together along the rigging in a display that draws Rosa ragged, exhausted. Cheer from more than one member of the crew, even as the storm continues to batter the ship around them. Nicias, Philemon sees, actually laughs, a short, disbelieving bark of relief, and shouts down to Straton that the brothers have both come, that the worst of tonight's danger has already passed, even if the wind has not yet finished proving it to them, and Philemon, watching the twin lights burn cold, and constant above the chaos of the storm, feels something in his own chest loosen for the first time since the tremors of thunder first began rolling in from the horizon hours earlier. The storm does not vanish all at once, the way Philemon half expects it to after Nicias's confident pronouncement. But over the following hour its violence does, gradually and unevenly, begin to ease, the waves losing some of their towering height, the rain slackening from a driving horizontal assault into something closer to ordinary heavy weather. And by the time the eastern sky begins showing the first faint, gray suggestion of approaching dawn, the twin lights at the masthead have long since faded, leaving no mark or scorch on the wood beneath them, no trace at all of their passing. Beyond the memory of every exhausted sailor who watched them burn, Philemon, still gripping his line, though the wind no longer truly requires it, finds himself staring up at the now ordinary, unlit mast, unless with a lingering sense of having witnessed something he will spend the rest of his life trying, and largely failing, to adequately describe to people who were not standing on that deck beside him. By full daylight, the Halcyon limps rather than sails toward the nearest safe harbor, her rigging torn in several places, one section of rail stove in where a wave caught her broadside during the worst of the night. But her hull sound and every member of her crew accounted or exhausted, but unharmed. Stratton makes the decision to put in at the small island port of Syros rather than continue on toward their original destination, both to make what repairs the ship urgently needs, and though he does not say this part aloud until they are safely tied at the quay, because a captain who has just watched his crew survive a night like that one owes the gods a proper thanks before asking his ship to face open water again. Nicias, walking the docks of Syros with Philemon beside him, while the rest of the crew begins the work of repair, points out a modest shrine near the harbor's edge, weathered by salt wind and clearly maintained by generations of grateful sailors passing through this same port, its walls hung with small carved offerings, model ships, painted plaques, tokens left by men who credit the twin gods with bringing them safely through storms like the one the Halcyon has just survived. It is here, standing before the shrine with Nicias, while Stratton makes the formal offering on behalf of the whole crew, that Philemon finally asks the question that has been sitting unspoken in his chest since the moment the second light fight first kindled at the masthead, wanting to know whether Nicias, in more than 30 years at sea, has witnessed the twin lights appear before this night, and whether the phenomenon is truly as rare and significant as it felt to Philemon in the middle of the storm, or whether experienced sailors have simply learned to expect it as one more ordinary hazard of a life spent on the water. Nicias considers the question for a moment before answering honestly that he has seen the lights perhaps 4 or 5 times across his whole career, always in the worst and most violent storms, never in ordinary rough weather, and that every experienced sailor he has ever spoken with agrees that whatever explanation might eventually be found for such a strange and specific fire, one that burns without consuming anything and appears only in conditions violent enough to test a ship and crew to their limits. It is not the kind of thing a man forgets having witnessed, whatever certainty or uncertainty he privately carries about which god, if any god at all, is truly responsible for sending it. The Halcyon remains at Seiros for the better part of a week while her rigging and rail are repaired. And it is during these days of enforced idleness, waiting for local craftsmen to finish work the ship's own limited crew cannot manage alone, that Philemon hears, for the first time laid out in full, by an old harbor priest tending the shrine to the twin gods, the fuller story behind the lights he watched burn atop his own ships, mast only days earlier. The priest explains that the twins, Castor and Polydeuces, were themselves once sailors in the oldest stories told about them, voyaging with Jason and the other heroes aboard the ship Argo in search of the Golden Fleece, and that it was during that same legendary voyage, according to the oldest accounts, the priest knows that the brothers first proved their power over storms at sea, calming a violent tempest that threatened to destroy the whole expedition, an act of protection sailors across the Greek world have called upon ever since whenever their own ships find themselves caught in, whether beyond ordinary danger, whether the lights Philemon dance along his ship's rigging represent the literal presence of these two gods returned once more to protect a struggling ship, or something else entirely that simply happens to appear more often than mere chance would predict, in exactly the conditions old stories describe. The priest admits he cannot say with certainty, only that generation after generation of sailors passing through this same harbor have chosen, storm after storm, to believe the former, and have kept this shrine standing on the strength of that belief for longer than even the oldest fishermen in Cyprus can fully account for. Years pass, and Philemon, rising in time from an inexperienced boy on his second season at sea to a helmsman in his own right, much as Nicias once was to him, finds that the storm off the Cyclades and the twin lights he watched burn above it never fully loosened their hold on his memory, resurfacing with particular clarity every time a new storm catches whatever ship he happens to be serving on, a private measure against which he finds himself, almost without meaning to, comparing every rough crossing that follows. He tells the story himself now, two younger sailors serving under him for the first time, in much the same halting, careful way Nicias once told it to him, watching their faces for the same mixture of disbelief and hope he remembers feeling as a boy clinging to a line in the dark, and he has come, over the years, to understand something about that the story that he could not have articulated on the night he first lived through it. That whatever a person ultimately believes about the true nature of the light stems themselves, what the story truly offers every frightened sailor who hears it is not a certain explanation, but a reason to keep working the ropes and the steering oar through the worst of a storm's violence, rather than surrendering to despair, a reason to believe that the sea, however dangerous it can be, is not entirely indifferent to the small, struggling ships that cross it. It will be many centuries after Philemon's own lifetime, long after the Greek world that produced him has given way to Roman rule, and then to still later ages of learning, before naturalists and scholars begin proposing explanations for the twin lights that owe nothing to Castor and Polydeuces, all describing instead a phenomenon of ordinary physical nature, an electrical discharge drawn from storm-charged air by the sharp points of a ship's mast and rigging. The same force that drives lightning itself, made visible in a smaller, steadier, and far less violent form wherever the air grows. Charged enough, and a tall, narrow point of metal or wood offers it a path to follow. Roman writers in the centuries after Philemon's death will record the same phenomenon under different names, debating among themselves, much as the sailors of Cyrus once did, whether a single light bodes ill and a pair bodes well, or whether the entire distinction is simply the accumulated superstition of frightened men reading meaning into a phenomenon that occurs, in truth, according to no divine preference at all, only the ordinary and impersonal conditions of a violent storm. Philemon, could he have heard such an explanation offered to him as a boy on the deck of the Halcyon, might well have found it interesting, even convincing, without ever quite managing to feel that it fully replaced what he actually experienced that night. Two lights, burning cold and steady above. Storm that should, by every reasonable measure of the danger they were in, have broken his young ship apart, and did not. It is nearly a decade after that first storm off the Cyclades, with Philemon now serving as helmsman aboard a different vessel entirely, a larger trading ship called the Eudora, working routes further south toward Crete, that he faces a test of the very question he has carried privately with him since his youth, one that neither Nicias's old certainty nor the Roman naturalist's later explanations will ever fully resolve. Caught again in violent weather, this time in open water south of Melos, with no island shelter, within easy reach, Philemon finds himself watching the masthead through hours of pounding rain and towering swells that seem, if anything, more dangerous than the storm of his youth, and no light appears at all, not one, not two, nothing but bare wood and straining rope against a black and merciless sky. He works the steering oar through the worst of it anyway, calling orders to a crew he has trained himself, relying on the same hard-won seamanship Nicias once taught him, rather than any sign from the heavens. And the Eudora comes through that night's danger, not through any divine fire at her mast, but through the simple, exhausting competence of tired men who refuse to stop working the ship until the danger has passed. In the calm gray morning that follows, one of the younger sailors aboard, a boy not much older than Philemon himself had been on that first terrible night off the Cyclades, asks him with open disappointment why the lights of the twin gods did not come to protect them this time. Whether some fault in the crew or the ship itself had turned the brothers away, and Philemon, drawing on a decade of thought he has given this exact question since his own first storm, gives the boy an answer that surprises him even as he says it aloud for the first time, that perhaps the lights, whatever their true nature, were never truly the thing keeping any ship afloat in the first place, only a sign, granted sometimes and withheld other times for reasons no sailor can fully predict or control, and that a ship's true safety in a storm has always rested, light or no light, on the steady hands and stubborn refusal to quit of the men working her ropes and her oar through the worst of the night. The boy considers this answer with the particular seriousness of the young and Philemon. Watching him return to his work with visibly restored confidence, understands that he has just passed along, in his own words, rather than Nicias's, the same essential lesson his old helmsman once gave him. Standing before a weathered shrine on the docks of Saros, that the sea rewards neither faith alone nor skill alone, but the two held together, one steadying the other through every storm a small ship and her crew are ever likely to face. Philemon sails the waters of the Aegean for the better part of 4 decades in all, rising eventually to own a small share in a ship of his own, much as Stratton once did, and training in turn a long line of younger sailors who carry his version of the story, and Nicias before him, onward into their own careers long after Philemon himself has finally retired from the sea to a modest house within sight, the harbor at Delos, close enough that he can still watch the ships come and go each season without any longer needing to risk his own aging body against their storms. It is here, in the last years of his life, that a passing scholar traveled him among the islands to record the customs and beliefs of sailors along the trade routes hears Philemon's story from the old man's own mouth. One account among many the scholar gathers that season and sets it down. Small entry among a great many similar accounts in a collection of sailors' testimonies that will itself, like so much else from this period of the Greek world, survive only in fragments and later references by other writers, rather than as a complete work. What neither Philemon nor the scholar recording his story could have anticipated, sitting together in the shade of a harborside courtyard, on Delos discussing lights on a mast, and gods older than either of them could trace with certainty, is how enduring this particular piece of sailor's knowledge will prove to be long after the Greek world that first named it Castor and Polydeuces has given way to Rome, and Rome in turn to the Christian sailors of a much later age, who will watch the very same pale, cold fire dance along their own ships, rips rigging their own violent storms, and will explain it not through twin sons of Zeus, but through a different set of protectors entirely, most often a shipwrecked bishop remembered as the patron saint of sailors, giving the ancient phenomenon the name still used in one form or another, wherever ships put out to sea many centuries after the last Greek trading vessel like the Halcyon ever left an ancient harbor, a light that different peoples, across a great span of human history, have looked up at through the worst nights of their lives and chosen, each in their own language and their own gods, to read as a promise that the sea, however violent, is not entirely without mercy for those who trusted enough to keep working through the storm. It is the 28th of May in a year fired 885 BC, on a dry plain beside the river Helis in Asia Minor, and a young Greek soldier named Jamin stands in the front ranks of King Eliatz's Lydian army as the battle line finally closes with the Median forces arrayed against them, the two sides meeting in a war that has already dragged on with brutal inconclusiveness for 5 full years. Damon is not Lydian by birth, but Greek, one of several hundred Ionian mercenaries hired into Eliatz's service for the steady pay and the promise of plunder, and he has fought in enough of this long war's earlier engagements, to know exactly what the coming hours will demand of him. The crush of shield against shield, the deafening noise of thousands of men and horses colliding at once, and the grim, unglamorous work of simply surviving long enough to see which side breaks first. What Damon does not know, standing in that line with his spear gripped tight and his breath coming fast, is that neither side's courage nor tactics will decide the outcome of today's battle at all. Because something is about to happen in the sky above the Hollies Valley that no army on this plain, on either side, has any way of predicting or preparing for. 200 miles to the west, in the prosperous Greek city of Miletus, on the Ionian coast, a philosopher and astronomer named Thales has spent the better part of the preceding year immersed in a very different kind of preparation, poring over records of past celestial events gathered. Babylonian sources that have reached the Greek trading cities of Ionia through generations of contact with the older civilizations of Mesopotamia. Thales is already, by this point in his life, a figure of considerable local reputation, a merchant-turned-thinker whose curiosity ranges across geometry, the nature of matter, and the movements of the sun, moon, and stars, subjects most of his fellow Milesians regard as interesting, but hardly practical concerns for a man of business and standing in the city. It is this same curiosity, applied with unusual patience to records of eclipses stretching back many decades, that has led Thales to a conclusion he has shared cautiously with only a handful of trusted associates. The dramatic darkening of the sun will occur sometime within a specific span of months, an event the Ionian Greeks, like most peoples of this era, still regard as an unpredictable and deeply ominous act of the gods, rather than the regular, calculable movement of heavenly bodies that Thales himself has come to suspect it actually is. Damon, on the battlefield beside the Hales, has never heard the philosopher's name and would have no particular reason to care about it, even if he had, absorbed as he is in the far more immediate concerns of staying alive through the opening clash of two armies that together number in the tens of thousands. The fighting, when it begins in earnest, unfolds exactly as brutally as 5 years of prior engagements between these same two forces have taught every soldier present to expect: a grinding, close-quarter struggle with no clear advantage, yet emerging on either side, the kind of battle that could plausibly continue for the remainder of the day without a decisive result, adding one more inconclusive engagement to a war that has already claimed more lives than either King Aliads of Lydia or King Cyaxares of Media seems able or willing to end through negotiation alone. It is perhaps 2 or 3 hours into the fighting, with the midday sun standing high and fierce over the dusty plain, that Damon first notices something wrong with the light around him. A subtle dimming at the edges of his vision that he initially attributes to sweat and dust, and the sheer physical strain of continuous close combat, the kind of sensory distortion any exhausted soldier might experience in the chaos of battle. But the dimming continues, steady and unmistakable, the harsh midday sun visibly losing its brightness in a way no ordinary cloud passing overhead could explain, and Damon, is not the only man on that battlefield to notice. All around him, on both sides of the fighting, other soldiers begin to falter in their strikes, weapons lowering as men glance upward despite the ongoing danger of combat. And within the space of a few more minutes, as the light continues its strange and rapid retreat from the middle of the day, sound of actual fighting across the whole battlefield begins to fall away, replaced by a rising murmur of confusion and, in more voices, with each passing moment, fear. Damon watches, along with every other soldier still standing on that darkening plain, as the sun overhead is consumed by degrees, a black shadow eating steadily into it to its bright disk, until only a thin, brilliant crescent remains, and then, within what feels to him like a single-held breath, even that crescent vanishes, and full daylight gives way to a darkness no ordinary evening ever brings this abruptly. Stars becoming faintly visible in a sky that had been blazing with midday sun only minutes before. The temperature itself seems to drop around him, and somewhere close by a horse screams in pure animal terror, echoed by others across the field. And Damon, gripping a spear he has entirely forgotten he is still holding, feels a fear more total than anything the actual violence of battle has managed to produce in him all morning. The specific, helpless fear of a man watching the fundamental order of the world appear to come undone before his eyes. Across the entire battlefield, on both sides of the fighting, weapons lower and then fall entirely still, soldiers both Lydia and Media standing frozen in the sudden unnatural dusk. And it is not, Damon will recall for the rest of his life, any order from a commander that first ends the day's fighting, but something closer to a single shared, wordless conclusion reached simultaneously by tens of thousands of frightened men, that whatever force has just swallowed the sun in the middle of the day is a sign no army has any business ignoring in favor of continuing to slaughter one another. King Aliats and King Cyaxares, according to the accounts that will circulate for generations afterward among the Greek historians who record this war, reach the very same conclusion from their respective positions overseeing the battle, and within the darkened, disordered hours that follow, as the sun gradually reclaims its light and the strange black shadow retreats back across its face. Messengers begin moving between the two camps, carrying not further orders for battle, but the first tentative overtures toward a peace that neither side's soldiers, exhausted by 5 years of inconclusive war, seem inclined to resist. The peace that follows, brokered in the days after the battle with the mediation of two respected neighboring rulers, Senesis of Cilicia and Labanitis of Babylon, both called upon by the shaken Lydian and Median kings to help formalize an agreement that neither side now wishes to abandon, establishes the river Halys itself as the permanent boundary between their two kingdoms, a border that will hold, remarkably, for the better part of the following decades. The treaty is sealed, in the custom of the time, through a marriage alliance, King Aliats giving his daughter Arianhizamidas in marriage to Astyages, son of the Median king, binding the two royal houses together by blood as well as by treaty, so that the war that very nearly continued indefinitely across An entire generation ends instead within days of a single afternoon, when the sun itself, however briefly, seemed to side against the continuation of the fighting. Word of what happened on the field beside the Halys reaches Miletus within weeks, carried along the same trade routes and travelers' reports that connect the Ionian coast to the interior kingdoms of Asia Minor, and it is not long before Thales' own quiet prediction, shared cautiously beforehand with only a small circle of associates who had mostly greeted it with polite skepticism, becomes public knowledge across the city, and then, gradually, across the wider Greek world. Damon himself, mustering out of Lydian service some months after the peace is finalized and eventually making his way back toward the Ionian coast, where he was born, hears the philosopher's name mentioned for the first time in a dockside tavern in Miletus, told by a fellow veteran of the campaign that the very darkness which had frozen 2 entire armies in place on that terrifying afternoon had, according to increasingly widespread report, been foreseen months in advance by a local thinker studying records of the heavens rather than the will of any god. Damon, who had spent the intervening months assuming, along with nearly every other soldier on that field, that he had witnessed a moment of direct and inexplicable divine intervention, finds the claim difficult to credit at first and makes his way out of the same restless curiosity that so many other Milesians eventually bring to Thales' door to see and question the philosopher himself. What Damon finds when he finally meets Thales in person is not the imposing, oracle-like figure he had half expected from the stories on this already accumulating around the philosopher's name, but a measured, careful man who seems almost uncomfortable with the growing reputation his prediction has earned. Him more interested in explaining the reasoning behind his conclusion than in claiming any special divine insight for having reached it. Thales tells Damon, much as has told the handful of other curious visitors who have sought him out since news of the battle spread, that he does not claim to have summoned or controlled the darkening of the sun in any way, only to have recognized, through patient study of records describing similar events stretching back many years, that such darkenings appear to follow patterns regular enough to anticipate within a general span of time, even if the precise mechanism producing them remains, in his own honest admission, still only partially understood to him. It is this distinction between claiming power over the heavens and claiming only the ability to read patterns already present within them that Damon carries away from their conversation as the most striking part of everything he hears that afternoon. A way of thinking about the sky, and perhaps about the world more broadly, that neither he nor any soldier standing frightened on that darkened battlefield had ever previously considered as a real possibility. In the years that follow, Thales' reputation grows well beyond the borders of Miletus, aided considerably by the sheer, undeniable drama of a prediction that ended a 5-year war within days of coming true, until later generations of Greeks come to number him among a small, celebrated group they call the 7 sages, wise men whose insight and judgment set a standard other thinkers across the Greek world would spend centuries trying to match. He is remembered not only for the eclipse, but for a wide range of other achievements, calculating the height of the Egyptian pyramids by measuring their shadows, proposing that water might be the fundamental substance underlying all other matter, and asking questions about the natural world that owe nothing to the traditional stories of gods and heroes that had, until his generation, provided the Greek world's primary framework for explaining phenomena exactly like the one that once froze two armies in place beside the river Halys. Damon, for his part, never becomes a scholar himself, returning instead to the more ordinary trade of a merchant sailor working the Ionian coast. But he tells the story of that darkened battlefield and his later conversation with Thales for the rest of his life, always ending the telling, in the years before his own death, with the same observation that first struck him standing in Thales's modest house, that the philosopher never once claimed to have commanded the sun, only to have learned, through patience and careful study, one small piece of its language. What remains uncertain, even now, so long after that afternoon beside the Halys, is precisely how Thales arrived at his prediction, with the specificity later writers credit him with, since the astronomical records available to the Greek world of his era, largely drawn from Babylonian observation, could reliably anticipate the general recurrence of eclipses without offering any way to determine exactly where on the Earth's surface a given eclipse would actually be visible, a limitation that leaves historians still debating, more than 2,000 years later, whether Thales achieved a genuine and remarkably early triumph of scientific reasoning, or whether a confident general prediction, made public at roughly the right time, was simply fortunate enough to coincide with an eclipse that happened to fall exactly where and when two exhausted armies most needed the sky itself to tell them that their war had gone on long enough. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe and leave a comment. Have a good night.